man a king, every man a king, for you can be a millionaire. But there's something belonging to others. There's
Thank you so much, and welcome everyone to this panel discussion. We hope it'll be an informal conversation, and you might join in with us later on in the program. But let me just say, as I was driving over here to Crowley, Louisiana, I was reminiscing about being a young reporter in 1972 at the state capitol. And Clay Fourier, our executive producer, was with me in the car, and I said, you know, I remember being so excited. It was an exciting time. This was Edwin Edwards' first term as governor, and I remember going to a press conference just thinking, I am the luckiest person in the world to be here in this time of change and excitement. And as I look back, LPB is celebrating our 40 years on the air. And we have some film clips for a recent celebration. And you have to just remember that during most of that lifetime, Governor Edwin Edwards was the governor of the state of Louisiana. He served unprecedented 4 terms as governor of the state. And I have to say to you, it couldn't have been more interesting, more colorful. It was the most amazing time to be a reporter in the state of Louisiana. And tonight, I hope we capture some of the interesting times, because it's hard to say any one thing about Governor Edwards, because he served for such a long period of time. And if you want to go and hear his own words, ladigitalmedia.org is our online archives. And I've been watching some of his earlier speeches, and an interview I did with him one time thinking, wow, if he were on the stage with the presidential candidates last night, he would have blown them away. The quips that he came up with were just amazing. So I'm so happy to be on this panel this evening with some terrific folks. And starting on my left, we have Gus Weill. Gus is, I always say Gus, a raconteur, author, public relations genius, the man who was the host of Louisiana Legends on LPB for many years, and my good friend Gus, thank you for being here.
Thank you, Beth.
And we have with us Leo Honeycutt. Leo, who was a journalist for commercial television for many years, beginning in KNOE in Monroe, and then has become an author and has published, and a great writer, the authorized biography of Edwin Edwards. And I was referring to it last night, Leo, remembering some things, and we can't wait to hear your stories. And then next to him, Billy Broadhurst, an esteemed attorney in New Orleans, a man very involved in all the campaigns of Edwin Edwards, a great friend who knows all the inner workings of how it all worked. He was a partner with Edwards in his earliest days here in Crowley, your home, and he pointed out as we were walking here to this beautiful theater, the law offices where Edwards first served. And we hope to hear a little bit about some of those earlier days as well from Billy Broadhurst. And next to me, Raymond Jetson, the Reverend Raymond Jetson, who is now a gentleman who's had many careers. He was a state legislator. He is a minister. And he is also a person who has been involved in the Harvard Leadership Project. And every time I see him, he has fabulous people coming in from Boston to learn about what we're doing here in Louisiana. So a man who has had many different careers, and we look and forward to his perspective. And next to him, a lovely lady who's responsible for much of the beautiful restoration we have here in Crowley, Louisiana, Isabella Dela Houssaye. I love our names here. Mayor of the city of Crowley from 1997 to 2006. She is also an esteemed businesswoman and accomplished so much about reviving Crowley. Also has known Edwin and his wife for many years, and so we look forward to hearing from her as well. And finally, we have Michael Martin, director of the Center for Louisiana Studies, and he is also a Regents Professor of History at the University of Louisiana at Lafayette. He is an author as well. He has studied about many different topics, and we hope you bring this historical perspective to us, Michael, so that we might enjoy how Edwin fits into the whole continuum of history here in Louisiana. But let us begin perhaps with the earliest days. And Billy, you remember when he was just a brand new attorney here in Crowley, Louisiana, right?
Yeah, Edwin came to Crowley in 1949 to first begin his law practice. And he started above Grimiald's drugstore where we walked by to get here. And by the time I got out of law school, he had built an office building over on the courthouse. And I was very fortunate when I got out of law school to be hired to the law firm of Edwards and Edwards, which was Nolan Edwards, his brother, and Edwin. At that time, Edwin had been on the Crowley City Council for several years and was running for the state Senate. He ran against a very powerful local incumbent state senator named Bill Cleveland, chairman of the Finance Committee, President pro tem of the Senate, very powerful man who made the mistake 2 years before the election of saying he thought he would run for governor. At which time Edwin decided, well, if you're going to run for governor, I'm going to run for the state Senate. Later, Cleveland decided to not run for governor and told Edwin he should run for the House because he wanted his old Senate seat back, of which Edwin declined. And it became a very interesting election because Cleveland ran back. Edwin won that election in a runoff with Cleveland, and it wasn't by a large margin of votes, and that's an important thing to remember about Edwin Edwards and his politics. There's things to learn there, because he won that election by just a couple of 300 votes, and you'll see when he ran for Congress what the difference made. But when I went to work there, I worked for him as his assistant, preparing cases for him, doing the briefs and going to court. And he was trying one, sometimes two cases a week. I can tell you that had he decided to stay as an attorney, he was a real modern day, for real Perry Mason in court. I never saw him lose a case. He was always at least 5 or 6 steps ahead of the opposing lawyer with where their questions were going and what they were doing. I promise you that had he not selected public service, he would have been a preeminent lawyer in the nation, just like some of the others.
Well, maybe some of the rest of you would like to jump in. Isabella, did he always have aspirations of being governor? Did he talk to you about that, or?
I think Edwin wanted to be governor. B.I. Moody tells a story of how when they shared offices, B.I. was a CPA, of how when they shared offices back in 1949 and 50, Edwin would tell him he was going to be the governor, and B.I. would say, well, you know, that's a foolish thing to talk about. You'll never be governor. Edwin always wanted to do that. In fact, after he became senator, at our office, a group of men from Lake Charles would come almost weekly to try to talk him to run against Congressman T.A. Thompson. And he was very interested, but didn't think that was the path he wanted to take at the time. And this is an interesting point that played a lot into his future election. One Saturday he called and said, "Are you available to drive to Ville Platte?" That's where T.A. Thompson was from. And I said, well, sure. And we went to T.A. Thompson's house where Ms. Thompson was, and he said to Congressman Thompson, "You know they've been trying to get me to run against you. I'm not going to run. I'm going to endorse you." And both of Mr. Thompson and his wife were very, very pleased, and that led to something down the road, which I will tell you, because later, the next year after T.A. Thompson was reelected, he was unfortunately killed in a traffic accident coming home for July 4th. And that day, a Senator Jack Frugier from Ville Platte, a state senator, called the office for Edwin. So Edwin is in the conference room with new clients, 12 of them, and Penny said, well, I can't interrupt him. He had real strong rules about don't interrupt me when I'm with new clients, and that was the rule. And so she said, well, let me talk to Broadhurst. So he told me about the unfortunate accident of TA and that Edwin needed to know. So I said, okay, I'll try. And I went in the room, and you could tell when I tapped him on the shoulder, he was not happy. What do you want? I said, well, Jack Frugier just called. He's on the phone. Thompson was just killed. His words were, "Take over the meeting." And I said, "Well, what are you meeting about?" He said, "That doesn't make any difference. The key is that's the last day he ever practiced law." He came, the next day they had what they call a Watts line.
Right.
In that election, and this goes back to that trip, in that election, Dr. Thompson from Ville Platte ran for his, he was the brother of T.A. Thompson. Mrs. Thompson, the congressman's widow, endorsed Edwin.
Well, that's interesting.
Over the congressman's, the deceased congressman's brother, and she said that nice young man drove all the way over here on a Saturday to tell us that he would support him. I like him, I'm supporting him. And it taught us all a very big lesson in politics. When you are going to do something in politics, don't just go put it in the newspaper or go tell them in person. And he did that, and of course I think Ms. Thompson's support really helped him in that election.
Well, you know, personal politics, he was just a natural politician. He was in the station just recently, so he's always had that. He would greet every single person going down the hall. He would touch them, he would talk to them. It was a very personal, it's a very different than the politics we have today, right, Leo?
Oh, very definitely. You were asking about, did he always think he was going to be governor? Now, Agnes, his mother, told the story a couple of times about how when they were at some event when he was about 6 years old, that he got a little bit rambunctious and she scolded him and said, and took him out on the front porch. She said dragged him by the earlobe and took him out on the front porch, and she just gave him the riot act and said, behave. And when she finished, he said he just looked up at her and said, when I'm governor one day, you won't be able to do that.
Always anticipating it.
Yeah.
Well, Gus, that politics has changed, but back then it was very personal, right? What was it? You grew up in Lafayette.
Well, I'm from Lafayette, and before I tell that little story, I want to congratulate Ms. Broadhurst, the people of Crowley. Your city is just beautiful. You've done a miracle. You really have. Beth, I was John McKithen's executive secretary, but before that, a man from Crowley put me on my feet and set me up in business. Judge Edmund Reggie from Crowley. He put me in business. So when Edwin announced for governor, I want to tell you about the first time I met Edwin Edwards. It was back in the 50s. Judge Reggie called me one day in Crowley, in Lafayette where I lived. He said, do you want to come hear a good political speech either in Orange or Beaumont, Texas? I said, who's talking? He said, a young senator from Massachusetts who wants to run for president. I said, Judge, that's a terrible ride to go here. He said, no, he said, a buddy of mine has a plane and he'll fly us. So I drove to Crowley and we went to your airport, and I'll never forget the first time I saw Edwin W. Edwards. Looked like a movie star, had on a poplin jacket and khaki pants and an accent thicker than any I'd ever heard, even in Lafayette. And he flew us to Texas. Judge Reggie's sister Yvonne made some sandwiches for us, and we ate them. So then, when I was McKithen's executive secretary, I had opportunity to befriend Edwards, and we became good friends. He called me in Baton Rouge. He said, Gus, I want to talk to you. Can you come to New Orleans? I said, yes. I went to New Orleans, and he said, I'm going to run for governor, and I want you to handle the public relations for my campaign. Well, I said, I'll be honored, my God. So we all shook hands, departed. The next day, I get a call from Judge Reggie. He said, you've got to quit the Edwards campaign. I said, what? What happened? He and the Edwards family, the Reggie family, had some kind of a silly falling out. And he pulled me from that campaign. I had to call Edwin and tell him what the deal was. So I'm the man who shot Santa Claus in the foot. However, in his next campaign for re-election, he did hire me, and bygones were bygones. He didn't have the time to carry a grudge. How bright was he? I'll tell you one little story. When I handled his campaign, we went to the television station in Baton Rouge. And he got there late. He said, okay, what do you need? I said, well, we need a 30-second spot. He said, about what? I said, well, I'm going to write it right now. Take me. He said, no. How long I got? I said, 28 seconds. He said, camera? They turned on the camera, and he gave this brilliant 28 seconds, perfect television spot. He was, and is today, a genius.
Well, you know, the interesting thing also, when we look back at that period of time, and Michael, our professor, I want to bring in, it was unusual to have someone of Cajun ancestry running for governor, or being governor, choosing to be governor. Right.
Absolutely. It wasn't unusual for someone to win a local office or a state level office from this region. On the other hand, for someone of Acadian descent or Cajun background with that thick accent to be able to win a state level political office such as the governorship was unheard of. In fact, it hadn't been done, at least since the early 19th century. The thing that changed, of course, by the early 1970s is there's this flowering, this renaissance of interest in Cajun culture and South Louisiana's French heritage. And I think Governor Edwards was able to capitalize on that, not only to generate votes, but also to generate interest in himself and in his campaign by the early 70s.
Isabella, do you find that there was this
I'd like to say something on that
sure.
while we're talking about Edwin being Cajun, because I read in doing a little research for this forum tonight that in fact he was not Cajun, that his mother and father were both came to Louisiana directly from France. And so Edwin really did capitalize on the Cajun culture and disposition, and he fit in perfectly, but I was shocked. Because every time he spoke to a public, at a public gathering, he talked about his mother and father who were Cajun, but the article that I read said that they were never, in fact, he had no Cajun relatives at all.
Well, the interesting thing, of course, he could be Catholic or he could be evangelical. You could be, back in that period of time, you were still sort of looked at your audience too, didn't you?
Beth,
say
he
what you want.
He did something that he doesn't get credit for, and I think it's his greatest accomplishment. He's the first Catholic and the first Cajun to be elected governor of Louisiana. Prior to that, your governors were white, Anglo-Saxon, Masons, primarily from North Louisiana.
Right.
And here came this guy out of the sticks, you might say, and was elected governor. And it just opened up the world for the Cajun people. Suddenly there was no ceiling.
Well, what now, in this last session of the legislature, you could choose to be a Cajun. You can put that on your YouTube, Raymond. I can choose to be a Cajun on our driver's license. And I think that's what you're suggesting, Michael, that really he opened it up. Because prior to that, people were saying, I wasn't allowed to speak French in school and all that. And so he made it, certainly accessible. But I think that's very interesting, the point you made as well. The other thing that in that very first term as governor that he did, and you have to correct me if I'm wrong on this, but I recall my good friend who was his press secretary, African-American woman, saying, it was the first time we were really allowed to be in the cabinet, and all kinds of positions were opened up. Do you give him credit for that, Raymond? What do you think?
Well, I mean, certainly in Governor Edwards' campaign and ultimately in his time as governor, he sought to make certain that people were represented. In my family being directly impacted in that my father was actually appointed to the parole board by Governor Edwards. I think that it was a mixture of making certain that he was loyal to those people who were loyal to him. And I had a conversation with him once, and he said, people get mad when I take care of my friends. Who am I supposed to take care of? And so he was very, very loyal to his friends. He was also very, very strategic in his politics, and he knew that there were certain things that he needed to do in order to solidify his base, and so he was strategic in the appointments that he made, in the positions that he gave to people, and he did things that were symbolic, but he didn't do them simply as symbols. And so putting Ruth Bailey as his press secretary, opening up for not only an African American, but an African American female to be in such a prominent position in 1972 was a very bold step in Louisiana and in Louisiana's history. But for him, she was a very, very talented person who deserved an opportunity. And that characterized him more than anything else in the interactions that I had with him.
Certainly in that first term, because as we're looking at Edward's legacy, if you will, it's a very different one through the different terms that he had. And in that first term is when we looked at, gosh, the Constitutional Convention. That was a big deal, wasn't it, Billy?
Well, that was what he had run on as a candidate, and that was his first bill to be introduced, and that passed, and it was set to trend for his whole future in office when he took, I think, 260
State
agencies
and chopped it to 15 cabinet positions.
And put them all into one sock of 15 different cabinet positions. And that alone was a feat, because you had so many egos on so many of those different agencies that were out there that didn't have any interest in giving up whatever power or influence they had in their agency, and then they had to be put in together with others and dilute their power. Only someone like Edwin could have convinced them that that was a good thing, not only for the state, but for them also.
Constitutional conventions can be scary propositions because everything can be changed during that period of time. And we now are in the history of Louisiana right now when people are talking about special sessions, but every time we bring up a constitutional convention, there's a little hesitancy. So that must have been terribly bold, do you think, Mike?
Oh, absolutely. It hadn't been done since the early 1920s for just that purpose. Huey Long had not done it. Earl Long had not done it. McKithen had not done it because, well, one, it was such a difficult proposition, but also because they felt in their times that there wasn't much of a need for it. So I think there was an opportunity as well by the early 70s to say this is clearly something that's become unwieldy. It's so large, it's so long. It's virtually impossible for any single human being to actually understand everything it says. So there was this general sentiment of something needs to be done, but you also had the right person at the right time to corral all of those interest groups and all of those interested parties to make sure that they could get on board with it.
Well, and we have this sort of love-hate, or maybe it's love-love relationship with oil in Louisiana. And you look at that weaving throughout our history. And certainly during this period of time, he decided maybe the state should be getting a little bit more, right?
Yes.
Who wants to take that one?
No, well, I'll tell you an interesting story about that one. It really goes to what his character and how he handled his friendships in the legislature, in that he looked out for the members of the legislature that were his friends as good or better and understood their districts maybe more than they did, because he needed 70 votes to get the tax passed, to change the tax on severance, and he had 69 votes, and Leonard Chabert, one of his big supporters from Houma, came in the Speaker's office that night and said, "Governor, I'm your 70th vote." He said, "Leonard, you're not my 70th vote." And Leonard, who was almost a disciple of Edwin, said, "Well, I don't understand. I'm here to help you." He said, "No, you're not. I'm here to help you, Leonard. If you vote yes on this, in your district, you'll go back, you'll get beat. I need you to stay here. I'll go get 70 without you. Thank you."
Wow.
And
That's
how
an
he did it.
interesting tale.
That's just the way he treated people and looked out for them and knew their politics as well as he knew his.
But he didn't shy away from the hard times like you're talking about, and you were asking about raising the money. When he took over in 1972, he inherited Gus, a $30 million deficit from Governor McKithen. And it was the largest in state history at that time. And so he was trying to scrub the budget everywhere he could. And he said, it's crazy for us to continue to only get 25 cents, 1/4, off every barrel of oil that comes off state lands. So he was fought vehemently, as you can imagine, by the oil interest in that first legislative session, and he lost. And so he came back in the second session and said, I'm going to push this through eventually. You may as well get used to it. And so he switched it from the 25 cents to 12.5% of value because he saw what OPEC was doing with regard to causing the price of oil to go up exponentially. And he said, we're going to ride this up. And sure enough, we did. By the late 1970s, we were the most cash-rich state in the nation at a time when New York City was going bankrupt.
I know, I was listening to some of the stuff that on our archives, and Edwards was talking to me about, how Texas envied Louisiana because we were doing so well. And I thought, gosh, I don't think Texas has been envying Louisiana for a while now. So it was a very flush time, was it not?
But,
yeah.
But
it was a flush time, but I think it was his leadership, and it goes back to something that Billy said from his practice of law. He was always steps ahead. I mean, whenever you talk to him, he was always steps ahead. He understood who he was talking to. I shall never, the first time that I went to meet him, I was elected in a special election, so everybody was already in office. I tell folks that I was a freshman class of one, and I was taken by a friend to meet him at the governor's mansion, and we started talking, and he opened up the conversation with, so I want to help you. Does that mean I need to endorse you or your opponent in your district, depending upon how people would react to it, whatever I need to do? But then he, in very succinct ways, began to talk about the composition of the district, how best he could help. But whenever we would talk about legislative matters, it was almost a chess game that he had already figured out all of the moves well in advance, and rarely did it play out in any way differently than he anticipated.
Isabella, you want to add to that? Do you think he was that clever in moving things around?
I do think he was, and of course he was best in his first 2 terms at doing those things. But Edwin, I've known people that just didn't want to like Edwin, and then they would meet him, and before the evening was over, they were in love with Edwin Edwards.
He was a throwback.
He had the charm. Yeah. And he knew everyone's name. Recently, we had him in Crowley, Beth, I was telling you earlier, and he agreed to do a fundraiser for us for the Welcome House, which is a homeless shelter here in Crowley for men, women, and children. And he came that evening, and we had a huge crowd. And as everyone walked in, he was at the door, and he would put his arm around the guy or the gal and say, now, who is your father? I know him. When they would give the name, he said, I know him. Was he so-and-so? It just blew my mind because, we're so many years from those early years that we've been talking about this evening, coming here in 2014, and still knowing everyone's relatives just by a few minutes, a few questions he would ask them. Your father was in farming, or your grandfather? Yes, he was, Governor. Well, I knew your grandfather, and I was thrilled that he still had that ability to make those fabulous connections. And he'd even tell them something personal about their family that those young people didn't even know.
I know, that's one reason probably why he was elected 4 times. Everybody kept thinking, I like him, and he's smart. He ought to be able to do better.
I think that he also
and I think there's a genuine like of him.
In being elected 4 times, I think it's easier if you have 4 consecutive terms, usually for most people. We talk a lot about term limits, and Edwin called me. I ran for the city council in 1978, and I won against an incumbent, and he called me the night of the election, and he said, congratulations, Isabella, you have just been elected to the worst political job anyone could have. You're going to see your constituents every day of the year.
Isabella, you are a Republican.
Yes,
and
I was
you
the
were a
first woman
Republican
and
then?
first
You were
Republican.
the first Republican.
And let's not
So-
forget, he put an end to the David Duke disgrace in Louisiana, because David Duke
Oh, he
was a
did.
disgrace.
Well, that's what I was going to say. I
And
mean,
Edwin Edwards shut him down.
but he was also lucky that it was David Duke that he ran against. I think it made for a much easier race for
Well,
him.
we're now jumping to his last.
Right, we're
his
going
last
from the
hurrah,
first of them.
if you will.
Right.
But before we kind of go to that period of time, I guess I'm trying to get his characteristics as a governor, because certainly, I will say this, he had a very open relationship with the media. We would go up into his offices. He would call you on the phone. You would wander in the mansion. We would have gatherings over there. I remember one particular. I saw the evidence of his power. This is before LPB was on the air. I was a radio reporter. I went up to the governor's office, and some bill was on the floor. Camille came in, and they were listening to the legislature. They were listening to the floor. They were listening to you, Raymond. And he was saying, this is how they're going to vote, Beth. This is what's going to happen, blah, 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 blah. And it all played out exactly as he said. And so I sort of thought to myself, now, why am I down there covering the House when it appears to be all the power is being moved up here? So he was a very hands-on. You knew when he moved in to a committee if he were for something or against something, and he really exercised it. On the other hand, so that's true. He was a very powerful governor. Secondly, though, he let his people do their jobs. I've talked to more people like Sally Clausen, who has said, he just would appoint you, and he never ordered you to do anything in particular. He would let you do the job. Is that?
He said, just don't mess
Yep.
up.
He gave you a lot of the
He would say, don't mess up.
don't mess up.
Don't embarrass anybody, and do your
Beth,
job.
I can tell you a funny story about that. And Edwin appointed my brother-in-law to the head of the dental board. And in those days, a lot of the young people were not passing the exam that they had, the state exam to become certified in the state of Louisiana to practice dentistry. And Edwin called our house one day, and my husband answered the phone, and he said, "What's the matter, Edwin?" And Edwin was furious because they were flunking so many of the young people were failing the exam, and they were calling the governor and saying, "My son finished LSU," or he finished actually Loyola, I think was the dental school at that time. He went to a Louisiana dental school, and he shouldn't be flunking these exams. All these people were calling the governor. And so he was looking for my brother-in-law, who was out, and Billy knew him well. His name was Lionel Delahousie. We called him Poochie. But anyway, he and Edwin, so he called Edwin, and he said, "Man, we'll see what we can do to try to get him to retake the exams." But he didn't ever tell my brother-in-law, pass everyone or anything like that. But when they started failing, he wasn't happy.
He will someday be thought of as right out of Shakespeare. His beginning, his middle, and his end, it ended up finally tragic. But that's right out of Shakespeare. You couldn't invent anything like that. Edwin Edwards was a throwback to Huey Long also. That fabulous magnetism, that his heart beating for the little man and the black man, the starter, the widow. He was mostly heart. I think that his undoing, and Billy, you could correct me on this, was I think he put his trust in people who he should not have put his trust in.
Yeah, he was a total trusting person, and he trusted people to a fault, and he would have people tell him so and so should not be there, and he said, but it was his friend, and he would stay with them, and a lot of times and way past when he should have. I was just thinking too, as good as he could be, as helpful as he was, I think one of his strong suits in that job was he had an easy ability to tell you no. He it did not, if he didn't think it was right, he wasn't going to play you along. He would tell you no up front. Well, Governor, I'd really like to explain this to you further. The answer is no. Well, can we talk about it? Well, we can talk about hunting, fishing, 5 or 6 other things, but on that subject, the answer is no. And, you know, people learn to be able to understand it wasn't something vindictive, it's just what he thought was the wrong thing to do. And it was really good, because he stopped things that he didn't think was
But the
right
job
thing
is
to
too
do.
complex to keep up with everybody and everything.
Yes, and Dave Treen learned that, didn't he?
Yeah, he did.
That's what finally caught up with Edwin Edwards. It was just too much. There were so many strings loose that it was no longer a tight package, and his genius was lost to the state.
I always thought it was very interesting that because he gambled and he was very good at some games of chance, but he did not want gambling to be legalized in Louisiana. And I always thought it was so interesting because he thought it shouldn't be brought back here. I thought that was an interesting thing, that he wasn't the one who did it. He was always telling me the games of chance that had the best odds, and of course I didn't know how to play any of them. So he was suggesting my husband and I should go out there to the Radio and Television News Directors Convention and play X whatever. And I was always like, well, I'll have to learn more about this. But one of the things he was extremely approachable. And I think it's from people from all walks of life, as you're saying. What do you think his legacy really will be? Because, of course, at the end, he was perpetually under investigation or indictment. Perpetually. And then finally, he wasn't actually convicted until he was out of office. So what do you think, how do you think history will judge him? Will they see him as this brilliant first 2-term governor who did all kinds of things, or will they just literally look at this story?
He'll be thought of as probably, along with Huey Long, our brightest governor. Not our best, but our brightest. I think that will be his legacy. And also his heartbeat with the common man. But the most important legacy he leaves is opening it up to Catholics and Cajuns to hold high office in Louisiana. Because prior to him, not a one, none, even came close.
What do you think? You listened to him an awful lot, Leo Honeycutt. You went to visit him over there in his prison.
Yep.
And you did lots of interviews with him, and he must have been pouring out what he wanted to be his history to be. What did he tell you? What does he want his legacy?
And we had a lot of fights over that last term and over, obviously, the trial. But there is one thing he told me that always stuck with me. He said, "You want to live a long time?" And I said, "Yeah, I guess, sure." He said, "Never hold a grudge." So that was the thing, never hold a grudge. And so that's when I said, well, okay, today'd be a great day to talk about Judge Frank Polozola. And
Very good.
so we had a very spirited discussion at that point, but he was right about that, and he let things roll off his back that most people today in the political realm is so politically charged, it's so personal, and we are gerrymandering districts to produce extremists, so consequently they go at, loggerheads. The government almost shuts down. And Edward said back in my day, and Russell Long actually told me the same thing several years ago, is that when everybody got, everybody would state what their philosophy was, they would argue their point, but when it was over, we all went out and we ate and drank together and we were friends.
Yeah. Billy?
He had a philosophy of inclusion, not exclusion, addition, not subtraction, which I think played a great part of his success. For example, when he beat Bill Cleveland by 200 or 300 votes for the state senate here, it was a very hotly contested race. Cleveland never called him to congratulate him. Edwin heard a couple of days later that Cleveland's son, Jennings Cleveland, was concerned because he had a job in the highway department, I believe, that was not classified, so he wasn't protected. It was an at-will position, and he was afraid that since there was such a lot of animosity in that race, that Edwin, now the senator, would dismiss him or have him dismissed, and that was all he had. Edwin picked up the phone and called him and said, "I hear you're worried. Don't worry. You're going to keep your job."
Well, how he didn't run me out of the state when I quit him. I quit. I would have had 16 good years. Reverend, it's like the years when things were fallow or the harvest was good. I would have had 16 years of harvest. And I want to tell you one funny thing about it. So Judge Reggie gets me to quit. I do. I handle Jimmy Davis's campaign. We lose. So I'm by myself at my house the day after the election, cussing to myself. And I pick up the paper, and there's a picture of Judge Reggie and Edwards with their arms around each other. And only Gus had been left out.
Judge Reggie was on the Constitution. He was part of the Constitution of delegation.
Yes, he was. I'm back to what his legacy.
Just to go back to that for 1 second with Jennings Cleveland.
Yes.
The way he included those who were against him.
Right.
So he wins that race in Acadia by a couple of hundred votes. When he ran for Congress a year and a half later, he had gone out and included all of those people without a grudge, as you say, Leo. And Acadia Parish gave him a plurality of 10,000 votes, wow, which a year and a half later, which put him in the runoff for Congress. It's because of that ability to not hold a grudge and to have inclusion.
Yeah, well, what do you think, Raymond? Let's let.
Yeah, I just think that whole notion of not holding grudges and being unbelievably relational. And for Edwin, it was about surrounding himself with people that he was loyal to, that he felt was loyal to him, giving them the opportunity to do what needed to be done as long as you didn't embarrass him. And I mean, he had the ability. Of course, it was a different time in politics in this state, but he had the ability to deal with the issues. And so if you could not vote with him on a particular issue, if you said, Governor, I can't do that, he moved on to the next person. Where you ran into a problem is if you said I could, and then you didn't. Because now you've lied to him, and for Edwin, that was the cardinal sin, because it was about loyalty and it was about relationships. I think it was this wonderful combination of heart and head. He genuinely cared about people. He was very, very relational, but he was also the shrewdest politician I ever met in my life. And he was always playing chess, not in a self-serving, manipulative way, but he had an agenda that he was attempting to accomplish, and regardless to the circumstances, he never lost sight of what it was that he was attempting to accomplish. I want to respond very briefly to the question you asked about the legacy, because I think it will ultimately be who he is, which is a very, very, very brilliant, compassionate person who had flaws. Kind of like the rest of us. His just happened to be lived out on a very bright stage.
Incidentally, to those of you who really want to know about Edwin Edwards, beyond what you know about him, this young man on my right has written a spectacular biography that took him 5 years to write, visiting the jail and everything else to write this book. And if he had been a professor, it would have won a Pulitzer Prize. It's that good a book.
Well, thanks, Gus.
Thank you, Gus.
The money's checks in the mail.
Well, Professor, what do you think the legacy will be?
I think it's difficult to say that there's a single legacy. It seems to me that there's probably 2 or 3 legacies. One of them is the style of politics that he clearly espoused, and that was what I think of as a politics of possibility, the politics that says government can actually do things that are good for the people. Government can be involved in the lives of the people, and that's not a bad thing. It's very different from most of the politics that we hear today, which is government needs to be reined in, government is the problem, government is bad, in essence. And I think that that political philosophy was something that Edwards shared with a lot of other politicians of his day. And whether it's a reflection of their growing up or coming of age during the New Deal, whether it's a reflection in Louisiana of growing up under Huey and Earl Long and McKithen or whoever else, it's very clear and evident and is a sort of generational thing that I see not only with Edwards, but also with people like Russell Long, Hale Boggs, Chet Morrison, people who may not have agreed amongst one another, but they all agreed that there was something that government and politics could do for people. I think, secondly, he'll be remembered mainly because of the 4 terms, that his career transcended these big shifts in politics in Louisiana, the rise of a viable Republican Party. He comes a little bit after the Voting Rights Act is implemented in '65, but he's really one of the very first white politicians in Louisiana to embrace black voters and to make them part of his political sphere. The aftermath of the women's movement, there's this enormous amount of change that's happening in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and his career kind of encapsulates that, not to mention the rise and decline of the oil economy. And then third, I think it's very evident to me, at least, that, and this is going back to what Gus said about this being a great Shakespearean tragedy or Greek tragedy, and that is his political, but also maybe his personal legacy is very contradictory. On the one hand, he was a person who could say no in a way that was very easy to take, and he could say it over and over again. But when it was an important time to say no to certain people, he did not, apparently. And that's what caused him the downfall or the tragic end. And so he was a political genius. He was brilliant at controlling and manipulating others. But he was also, to some extent, either he allowed things to get out of his control or he was able to be manipulated a little bit himself.
Well, Isabella, I won't ask you to comment on this, but as I would travel around in the country, people would say to me, now your governor, is he really known as a silver zipper? Did he really say I can get elected unless I'm found in bed with a, what did he say, a live
boy,
or a dead girl? And did he really say that? I would say, yes, it was at a press conference and we were all there. So truly, I mean, and they were astounded. And I would say, but imagine, if you're in television, these stories are incredible. What was that like, though, for the rest of the country? Was that good for us because it was colorful? It certainly was entertaining. Leo, we were covering it, and it was interesting. But was that good for Louisiana's reputation?
Well, I have to say I didn't like Edwin Edwards because he was so arrogant about some things. We got into a press conference situation, as you well know, and he could cut us down to size.
We never did that to me. I don't know about you.
Well, that's because, he probably liked you probably better than most everybody else. But by and large, he never ran from anything, that's for sure. I mean, he hit everything head on. And it is funny, you talked about that line that he said about if I could only be defeated now if I was caught in bed with a live or a dead girl. When I was writing the book, I had no less than 4 people that took credit for that line. 4 people. And even when I interviewed Dave Treen, he started his interview with me and he said, that line that Edwin came up with about me being so slow, it took me an hour and a half to watch 60 Minutes. He said, that was really a great line. Doty didn't think so, but
Exactly. So he did have all those quips. And so you wonder on balance, what was our reputation around the country? That was one of the things we're thinking about. And what did that do,
Edwin was the master of a quick reply, just a very, very clever. I think the nation really loved it because everybody knew what his latest quip was, but did they agree with it? Not necessarily. They didn't think that that it was good for Louisiana. Many Louisianians didn't like it. So, but he just couldn't resist. And we have to all admit everything he said was really funny and very clever.
Only he and Franklin Delano Roosevelt were elected to 4 terms.
Well, I think that it was clear that Edwards loved being governor. He wasn't always looking for another position, although there was a period of time where I seem to recall that, didn't he do a seconding speech for Jerry Brown at a national convention for president? But as I recall, they switched to a commercial during the television version of it, so we never got, is that right?
That's correct.
I'm remembering that.
Good.
I think we did a gridiron skit on that at that point. But did he aspire to other office, or was governor the pinnacle?
I don't know. There were a group of people in Louisiana that were his friends before Jimmy Carter ran that took him on a trip to say, you should run for president. And he said, the 2 highest things I think you can aspire to in Louisiana was a United States senator and a governor. I don't think anybody from the South will be able to do that again. and I am the governor, and I don't care to be the United States Senator. So this is for naught. There's no use us discussing a higher office. Of course, later, Jimmy Carter won and kind of dispelled that a little bit, but it was all because of special circumstances that Jimmy Carter did win. And what Edwin had said at that time, I believe, was a correct statement. That's what he believed, too.
Well, we want to ask you if you all would like to join us in this conversation. I think there's a mic right up here. You want to ask some questions of this esteemed panel? Anybody out there? The lights are in my eyes.
You know, one thing that he did say about the Jimmy Carter thing is very true. But because of the way he had handled those 2 terms, and he set the ship of state way beyond correct when it came to cash flow. Remember, the headlines used to say an embarrassment of riches.
Embarrassment of riches.
And so because he was successful at that, and because of Edmund Reggie, Edmund Reggie tried to put him and Ted Kennedy together, and Ted Kennedy was going to take on Jimmy Carter for the nomination. He didn't succeed, but he had actually floated up the idea of having Edwin Edwards on the ticket with him, and he wanted him to work his magic. He had worked in Louisiana with the national budget, and that was the only time he actually played with the idea of national office.
Yes.
I have just one question of Billy B. Besides the Constitutional Convention and the all tax, isn't it true that Edwin was instrumental in the success of having the Superdome actually built?
No.
No?
Well, John McKithen had the idea based on local people, and however, Gus, I believe he underestimated what the cost would be.
Right.
Quite a bit.
That's the understatement.
And when John McKithen left the office, there were no money to build it, and Edwin Edwards did go out and find the money, find the bonds, and get it ultimately built. So I think
that's not how I remember it, but my friend Billy is a bright, brilliant lawyer, and I'll not argue with him. But John McKithen built the Louisiana Superdome.
he did originate it. There's no doubt.
There's a statue of him today outside the dome in honor of him building it.
Well, and I think we were paying it off for many years afterwards. In fact, I would say half of North Louisiana was very unhappy with they thought we'd be paying for the Superdome from now until eternity, and sort of we are.
Well, what McKithen did was, we'll talk about brilliant, he was going to appoint a board to run the dome. And they said, oh, that's going to be wholesale stealing. So he appointed the heads of the architecture and the engineering colleges of every college and university in Louisiana. That was the first Superdome board.
And there's no doubt, not only did John McKithen originate it, but at one time they wanted to put it out by the airport. He insisted that it be put on Broadhurst Street, which there was no hotels, no other buildings,
right.
And it led to the renaissance of that area. But when they ran a story on Deb, on the Superdome, I think the newspaper ran it a couple of weeks ago, less than a month ago. Mm-hmm. And I talked to Edwin that day, and he said, can you believe they write a story about the Superdome and they give all the credit to John McKithen, who did have the original idea, but I'm the one that went and found the money and built it.
That's what
he said, they did not put my name in there one
wrong.
time.
Well, there you
I was just
That's
trying to get some
our
clarification.
All right, great.
Beth,
Other questions? Anybody?
Beth, I have a question.
Okay, great.
Because I know that when I first moved to Crowley in 1970, my mother and father-in-law, several years after, which would have been when Edwin was governor, they loved him, by the way. They were next-door neighbors. And they invited my mother-in-law to come to the ribbon cutting for the work done on the interstate at the Atchafalaya, where the interstate ran into the Atchafalaya Basin. So I'm wondering, was that Atchafalaya part built during Edwin's first term as governor? Because Edwin cut the ribbon with Elaine, and my mother-in-law was standing right next to them.
It was completed at that time, but it had been under construction for years before that.
Right, but I mean the Atchafalaya section. Crossing the
Basin
Atchafalaya
Expressway.
Basin.
Beth,
Yeah.
may I tell one political story?
Well, wait, let's see. Does anybody have an answer to this question before you? Yeah. You know, he gave me a scoop, and it was that, and I'm trying to remember, it was about I-49.
No,
So it was a different part. It was kind of like they were taking some money from highways that were supposed to be used around New Orleans, and they were using it to complete I-49. And I got the scoop because I was reporting for KWKH radio in Shreveport, and they were very concerned about the completion
That's
of
funny
that.
because there's an article in today's paper about the present government wanting to do something very similar right
Exactly.
now.
Well, what we discover, if you look back in the archives, you can look back into debates about issues. Many of the issues we're still facing: unfunded accrued liability, bond ratings, what should the oil and gas industry be paying for or not, are all the things that we have always been confronting, I kind of think. So you wanted to tell us?
I wanted to tell one story because it's one that y'all have never heard. I just heard it today. I had lunch with some men, and I was the youngest person there. I'm 83. And there was an old doctor man, and he was a former, he's the oldest living LSU professor. He taught engineering. And he told me back in the late 30s they were at an LSU game, and Huey Long sat on the bench with the team. And an LSU player scored a touchdown. And Huey got up from the bench waving a $50 bill and ran to the boy and gave it to him. And about 2 weeks later, the coach quit, and they wouldn't let Huey sit on the bench anymore. So that was Louisiana in the 30s.
Well, let's add that to our story knowledge. I'm going to share
Beth,
that. Yes.
You mentioned when you opened up about the debate last night and about how Edwin could have been on there. His wit would have outdone all of them. Well, in fact, I have seen him finesse Donald Trump.
Oh, really?
Yes. Donald Trump, in the days of riverboats, when he was building his casino company, thought that he should get one of the 15 riverboats. And he really played hard to get that riverboat. And so he's coming to town to meet with the governor at the governor's mansion. And I see Sammy Nunez, the president of the Senate, and John Alario, the Speaker of the House that day. And they say, you know, Edwin invited us to come to dinner tonight at the governor's mansion to meet Donald Trump. What's all that about? I said, I have no idea. I said, but we'll find out, I'm sure. So they have dinner. Trump is there in all of his glory with his people, and it was very cordial, very nice. And at the end of the dinner, he says, Donald, I know you're really interested in getting a riverboat in Louisiana, and I'd really like to help you. But the Speaker of the House and the President of the Senate have committed all the boats, and there's none left for me to get.
Wow.
That's a very interesting story.
That's a true story. It happened right in the dining room in the back in the mansion.
So he got to say before Donald Trump, "You're fired."
Yeah, he did. He fired Donald Trump. The thing is, he finessed it so well that Trump didn't even realize what happened to him. And he was back, going back to New York.
There would have been no match there.
Right.
I mean, Edwin was really a very brilliant man, and really.
Of course, as we sit here with the rice surrounding us in Crowley and everything, I am remembering all the Tung Sung Park tales and all of that. And I remember watching them move out of the mansion. We used to watch them move in, move out, with a beautiful inlaid table, and I always wonder what happened to that table. Did you talk about that much with him, Leo?
Oh, yeah. We talked about it, and he said he would do it again with Tongson Park, because what Park had done, I forget now who the president was of South Korea, but he had sent Park over basically to try to make sure that because we were pulling out of Vietnam, we were not going to pull out of South Korea. And so he was stationed in Washington to try to schmooze with some of the legislators to make sure that they did not allow that to happen. So Edwin and Otto Passman from the 5th District figured out that their main import was rice, and they got all their shipments from California. So they got together with Tongson Park, did not author any legislation for him, didn't really do anything for him, but they said it really would help us out if you would buy all your rice from Louisiana. So sure enough, in 1970, it was the biggest rice deal in history. They bought $40 million exclusively of Louisiana rice.
Cannell was the man's name. The one who, with the right, you heard that name before, Billy?
Yeah, Mr. Connell.
Connell.
The biggest rice
Broker, I guess, in the business.
brokers in the business.
So anyway, that's what happened. And then when he became the poster child for the investigation in the mid-1970s, he was going into his second term.
Yeah, and that was the time where the controversy began plaguing him.
Right.
And as I recall, I think Elaine at the time had gotten $10,000 and she'd neglected to mention it. And I always thought to myself, I wonder if I'd gotten $10,000 and neglected to mention it to my husband, he would, I could have done that.
You
I
probably
guess.
would have told everybody that you got $10,000.
I don't know, it was a
I
very
want to tell
interesting
you,
time.
and Billy, I'd be curious, an error that I think Edwards made that hurt him terribly. When the first trial was in New Orleans, and he beat the government like a drum, Volz was the U.S. attorney.
Correct.
And he was so proud, he drove back to the motel where they were staying in a carriage, one of those carriages that carry tourists in New Orleans.
I don't believe it was the day he won.
Day after?
But no, before.
Before.
Yeah.
He would come to court, he and Marion, riding in the carriage, coming to court
Big time.
from the Montleon or wherever they
Right.
were.
So they won.
And they were
Edwards
riding.
won big. And he forgot it. That's over. But I think from that moment on, the United States government, with its massive resources, I think they never stopped keeping an eye on him. And I think that may have been, what do you think, Billy? Is that possible?
Yeah, I think that what he did do, and Leo, you probably talked to him at length about this, but when the trial was over and he was exonerated, he went down to the front of the courthouse on the steps and really trashed the votes
Right.
and the whole
Right.
U.S. Attorney's Office as being a cesspool of corruption.
Right.
And I mean, he went on
For the Republican government.
for the Republican government. He went on
Yeah.
for 4 or 5 minutes.
Yeah, and he probably shouldn't have done that.
Yeah.
He gloated because, now remember, this were two trials, 85 and then 86.
Yeah.
Bells turned around and retried him immediately, and that's when he was acquitted. It was a hung jury first, then he was acquitted. But yes, he went out there and he really blasted the federal system, and I think that is when they really started in earnest, begin to
Beware
say.
of Uncle Sam.
That's right. But now the Tongson Park, to finish that story, understand that there was only one congressman in the whole country that went to trial and was convicted, and that was Congressman Hanna of California. Everybody else was acquitted.
Beth, if I could just one thing, because we are having this conversation about Governor Edwards in the context of a gubernatorial election. And many of the realities that he faced in 1972 have been updated to 2015. You still have a governor who's going to inherit a budget that is terribly out of whack. There are issues around oil and gas all over again. And the question that I find myself sitting here wondering as we talk about the impact of Governor Edwards on this state is who among those who have offered themselves for that office has the ability to walk in and so masterfully navigate the challenges that face this state. You know, it was interesting, Professor Martin was talking about Edwin's philosophy that government could actually help people. But on the other hand, he was the same person who was actually shrewd enough to pull off a constitutional convention to shrink the size of government, not a part of his legacy that you hear much about. And so I just wonder, where is that leadership in Louisiana today? Because God knows the challenges of this state demand a level of leadership that is far beyond what has been demonstrated in our state over the last few years.
Well, as we are running out of time, I've been given some signals. I was actually thinking that this Cultural Vistas magazine has a wonderful picture on the cover of Edwin. And I like to think about the time that was the pinnacle of his just ebullience about being governor, and that's when he went to France. And he recaptured his French heritage, if you will, and it was such a time when he was so proud, surrounded by everyone. And even his, not his supporter, only his supporters were on the trip, but others were on the trip as well. I think Bennett Johnston, whom he had defeated in his first run for governor, was on that trip with his daughters as well. And it was such a time where you thought there was so much possibility.
That's interesting.
Possibilities.
Yeah, and Beth got to go. You got to go.
I did.
Yeah,
it was
well,
very
some
exciting.
of the rest
We
of us
covered
didn't
it.
get to go.
Well, there was a big media contingent there, and it was an extraordinary time. It truly was, and I think, you know, looking back, of course, across our history, we will remember both the good and the bad, but the permanent problems that are with us, and the joy of being in public service. And I think that joy, that commitment, that politics of the possible, is that what you said, Michael?
Yes.
I think that is one of the legacies that we have out of this particular governor. And I thank you all for being on this panel. I thank you so much, and I thank the Louisiana Endowment for Humanities for allowing us to do it, and for you for joining us. Good night.
Every man a king, for you can be a millionaire. But there's something belonging to others